Making America, Chapter 7, Competing Visions of the Virtuous Republic, 1770 to 1796. Individual Choices, Gouverneur Morris. Gouverneur Morris was one of the most brilliant men of his revolutionary generation. As the heir to a vast fortune, Morris was free to study political philosophy, languages, and the law, and to travel widely. When the Constitutional Convention met in Philadelphia, this veteran of the war was eager to serve as a delegate from the state of Pennsylvania. When he rose to speak, which he did more often than most, his fellow delegates forgot about his damaged right arm and his peg leg, souvenirs of childhood accidents. Instead, they listened with respect or annoyance to his insightful, bold, but often sarcastic comments on the issues facing the convention. We'll see the individual voices feature at the end of this chapter. He viewed himself, he declared, as a representative of the whole human race, not simply the people of Pennsylvania, and for their sake, he advocated the principle that the consent of the governed was fundamental in government. Whether they agreed or disagreed with his views, everyone acknowledged that Morris was a master orator and a gifted writer. It was no surprise, then, that the delegates turned to him to bring clarity and organization to their work and to polish the language of their proposed constitution. It was Morris who penned the preamble and who created the orderly list of articles in the document. Unlike most delegates, Morris did not actively campaign for ratification of the Constitution or run for office once the new government was approved. Instead, he left for Europe, spending a decade there before returning to his family's estate in New York. In Paris, he watched the French Revolution's promise of liberty fall victim to the bloody reign of terror, a tragedy he was proud to say his own young nation had avoided. He knew, he wrote to a friend, that his nation's Republican government had its flaws, but he took it knowing all its bad qualities because he loved its virtues. Between 1776 and 1783, Americans fought to create an independent nation. But what kind of nation would that be? Most free white Americans embraced the idea of a republic. Yet a republic could take many forms, and Americans who enjoyed a political voice disagreed on what form was best. During the years following the Revolution, Americans grappled with critical questions. How should power be divided between state and national governments? How should laws be made, and by whom? Who should administer those laws? What programs and policies should the national government pursue? How could the government be designed to protect the unalienable individual rights of free white Americans? These questions had to be answered, and soon. The Articles of Confederation were the nation's first effort at Republican government, but many political leaders believed this government was too limited in its powers to solve America's economic and social problems. In 1787, delegates to a constitutional convention produced a new plan of government, the Constitution. The result of many difficult compromises, the Constitution created a stronger national government, but Anti-Federalists who opposed its adoption argued that it threatened the basic ideals of the Revolution, especially the commitment to local representative government. Federalists argued that America's survival required the new Constitution. Leading patriots of the 1760s and 1770s could be found on both sides of this debate, but the Federalists carried the day. The adoption of the Constitution did not magically solve all of America's problems. Tensions remained between competing visions for the new nation. Nevertheless, when President George Washington said his farewells to public life in 1796, which is when this chapter ends, most Americans were confident that their young United States would survive. America's first constitutions, considering the questions, what types of legislatures did the states create? What were the major elements of the Articles of Confederation? And what problems arose in ratifying the Articles? The writers of state constitutions were the first to deal with troubling but fundamental issues, in particular, the definition of citizenship and the extent of political participation. Could landless men, servants, free blacks, or apprentices enjoy a political voice? Should women with property be allowed to vote? These were exactly the kinds of questions that John Adams feared might arise in any discussion of voting rights or suffrage. They raised the specter of democracy, which he and most other revolutionary leaders considered a dangerous system. Once the question was posed, he predicted, there will be no end of it. Women will demand a vote. Lads from 12 to 21 will think their rights are not enough attended to, and every man who has not a farthing, which is a British coin worth 1/4 of a penny, and thus a term used to indicate something of very little value, every man who has not even a farthing will demand an equal voice with any other man in all acts of state. English political tradition supported Adams's view that political rights were not universal. Under English law, rights were, in fact, particular privileges that a group enjoyed because of special social circumstances, including age, sex, wealth, race, or religious affiliation. In their first constitutions, several states extended voting rights to all free white men, which was a democratic reform, but one that still set special conditions of race and sex. The state constitutions reflected the variety of opinion on this matter of democracy within our republic. At one end of the spectrum was Pennsylvania, whose constitution abolished all property qualifications and granted the vote to all white males. At the other end were states such as Maryland, whose constitution continued to link the ownership of property to voting. To hold office, a Marylander had to meet even higher standards of wealth than the voters. While constitution writers in every state believed that in a republic the legislature was the primary branch of government, they remained divided over other issues. Should there be a separate executive branch? Should the legislature have one house or two? What qualifications should be set for office holders? Again, Pennsylvania produced the most democratic answer to this question, concentrating all power to make and to administer laws in a one-house or unicameral elected assembly, and eliminating the executive office. In contrast, Maryland and other states divided powers between a governor or executive branch and a bicameral legislature, bicameral meaning there's two houses, although the legislature enjoyed broader powers. Members of the upper house and Maryland's bicameral legislature had to meet higher property qualifications than those in the lower house or the assembly. Thus, political leaders in this state ensured their elite citizens a secure voice in lawmaking. Pennsylvania and Maryland represented the two ends of the democratic spectrum. The remaining states fell between these poles. The constitutions of New Hampshire, North Carolina, and Georgia followed the more democratic tendencies of Pennsylvania. New York, South Carolina, and Virginia chose Maryland's more conservative and traditional approach. New Jersey and Delaware took the middle ground, with at least one surprising result. New Jersey's first constitution, written in 1776, gave the vote to, quote, all free inhabitants who met certain property qualifications. This requirement denied the ballot to propertyless men, but because it did not stipulate male inhabitants, it granted voting rights to property-holding women. A writer in the New York Spectator in 1797 snidely remarked that New Jersey women, quote, intermeddling in political affairs, made that state's politics as strange as those of the Emperor of Java, who never employs any but women in his embassies. Nevertheless, for 31 years, at least a few New Jersey women regularly exercised their right to vote before this error was corrected. A state's particular history often determined the type of constitution that it produced. For example, New Hampshire, South Carolina, Virginia, and North Carolina, where the colonial governments had been dominated by coastal elites and lowland gentry, ensured representation to small farming districts in interior and frontier regions. The memory of high-handed colonial governors and elitist upper houses in the legislature led Massachusetts lawmakers to severely limit the powers of their first state government. The constitutions in all of these states reflected the strong political voice that ordinary citizens had acquired during the Revolution. Beginning in the 1780s, however, many states revised their constitutions, increasing the power of the government. At the same time, they added safeguards that they hoped would prevent abuse. Quick note that our nation as a whole would follow that pattern. The Articles will be replaced with the Constitution in the 1780s as well. The 1780 Massachusetts Constitution was the model for many of these revisions, building in a system of checks and balances among the legislative, judicial, and executive branches to ensure that no branch could grow too powerful or overstep its assigned duties. Most of these revised constitutions also restored wealth as a qualification to govern, although they did not allow the wealthy to tamper with the basic individual rights of citizens. So the wealthy have power, but their powers are limited. In 7 states, these individual rights were safeguarded by a Bill of Rights guaranteeing freedom of speech, religion, and the press, as well as the right to assemble and to petition the government. And again, our nation as a whole is going to follow that exact same pattern. We will have our own Bill of Rights to our national constitution following its ratification. The Articles of Confederation. But what of the national government? Soon after the Declaration of Independence was approved, the Continental Congress set about drafting a national constitution. The frame of government they produced, called the Articles of Confederation, was primarily a response to the injustices that had led them to revolution. For example, because they wanted to avoid the tyranny experienced under King George III and the royal governors, the Articles eliminated the executive branch entirely. Because the colonial councils, or upper houses of the legislature, had been the domain of the richest and often the most conservative men in a colony, the Congress gave the Confederation a unicameral, or one-house, legislature. Because Britain's trade regulations had stifled American trade and kept colonies from expanding their markets, they gave the Confederation no power to regulate the new nation's commerce. In addition, the men who wrote the Articles refused to give the central government the power to tax. Most members of the Continental Congress shared the popular belief that only men the voters knew, who lived among them and shared their economic interests, had the right to impose taxes on citizens. That is, the power of the purse belonged to local governments. So here you have a national government that is unable to tax. There's no executive branch. There are several ways that its powers are curtailed or cut short. This highly restricted national government suited most voters who expected their state governments to remain sovereign, independent entities. In 1776, it was reasonable to come together in a league of friendship to wage the war and to make the peace, but most patriots would approve John Adams's characterization of the national government: a confederacy of states, each of which must have a separate government. The debate over other clauses in the Articles revealed how eager the delegates were to protect and enhance the power of state governments. The majority of the Continental Congress agreed that the state legislatures, not the voters themselves, should choose the members of the Confederation Congress. But they did not agree on how many members each state should have. Should the states have equal representation or proportional representation, which would be based on population? John Dickinson, who had written the first draft of the Articles, argued for a one state, one vote rule, but Benjamin Franklin insisted that large states, such as his own Pennsylvania, deserved more influence in the new government. Dickinson's argument carried the day, and the Articles established that each state was entitled to a single vote when the Confederation roll was called. The same jealous protection of state power also shaped the Confederation's amendment process. Any amendment to the Articles of Confederation would require the unanimous consent of the states. Arguments over financial issues were as fierce as those over representation and sovereignty. Because the Confederation would not have the power to tax, it was agreed that it should be supported by contributions from the states. But how was each state's share of the Confederation's operating budget to be determined? Dickinson reasoned that a state's contribution should be based on its population, including inhabitants of every age, sex, and legal condition, meaning free or unfree slave. Southern political leaders protested this proposal. Because their states had large, dependent slave populations, the burden of tax assessment would fall heavily on slave masters and other free white men. In the end, state assessments were based on the value of land, buildings, and improvements rather than on population. The Continental Congress thus shrewdly avoided any final decision on the larger question of whether slaves were property or people. When Congress finally submitted the Articles to the states for their approval in November of 1777, the fate of the Western territories proved to be the major stumbling block to ratification or passage of the Articles. In his draft of the Articles, Dickinson had designated the Northwest Territory as a national domain, but states with colonial charters granting them land from the Atlantic to the Pacific Oceans each claimed the exclusive right to the lands beyond the Appalachian Mountains. Delegates from Maryland, a state with no claim to Western territory, dug in their heels, insisting that citizens of every state ought to have the right to pioneer the Northwestern territories. Maryland's ultimatum, no national domain, no ratification, produced a long stalemate, but it finally ended when the states with Western land claims ceded or gave up their claims to Congress. In 1781, Maryland became the 13th and final state to ratify the Articles of Confederation. Establishing this first national government had taken an agonizing 5.5 years, and they're fighting a war at the same time. Challenges to Confederation. Considering the question, what problems face the Confederation? What gains did nationalists expect from a stronger central government? And how did the Confederation establish relations with other nations? The members of the First Confederation Congress had barely taken their seats in 1781 when Cornwallis surrendered at Yorktown and peace negotiations began in Paris. These political leaders realized that this new nation faced a number of daunting problems. The long home front war had left physical, psychological, and economic scars. In New Jersey and Pennsylvania, communities were still recovering from the rape and looting by British occupying armies. In the South, where civil war had raged, a steady stream of refugees filled the cities. In New England, post-war economic depression and food shortages became worse when an insect attack destroyed the local wheat crops. The post-war depression seemed to touch everyone's life. 4 years after the American victory, Thomas Jefferson might boast that Americans adore their country, its climate, its equality, liberty, laws, people, and manners. But America's unemployed sailors, debt-ridden farmers, and destitute widows and orphans would have found it difficult to share his enthusiasm. Depression and financial crisis. Financial problems plagued wealthy Americans as well as poor farmers and unpaid Revolutionary War veterans. Many merchants had overextended their credit importing foreign goods after the war. Wealthy land speculators, a speculator, by the way, is a person who buys and sells land or some other commodity in the hope of making a profit. Wealthy land speculators had borrowed too heavily in order to grab confiscated Loyalist lands or portions of the Northwest Territory. Southern planters were hard hit when the demand for staple crops, such as rice, dropped dramatically after the war. By 1786, the New England fisheries were operating at only about 80% of their pre-war level. Not surprisingly, the English did nothing to ease the plight of their former colonists. In fact, Britain banned the sale of American farm products in the West Indies and limited American shipping there. These restrictions hit New England shipbuilding so hard that whole communities were impoverished. The Confederation government was itself helpless to solve its own most pressing problem, debt. To finance the war, the Continental Congress had printed more than $240 million in paper money backed by, quote, good faith, rather than by the hard currency of gold and silver. As doubts grew that the government could ever redeem these continentals for hard currency, their value fell rapidly. The scornful phrase, not worth a continental, indicated popular attitudes about a government that owed money both to its citizens and to its allies abroad. In 1781, the government turned to Philadelphia shipper and merchant Robert Morris for advice on how to raise funds. Morris, known as a financial wizard, came up with a solution: ask the states to approve federal tariffs or import taxes on certain foreign goods. The tariffs would provide desperately needed income for the Confederation and relieve the states of having to contribute funding that many could scarcely afford. But even this modest plan failed. Both Virginia and Rhode Island said no, and to add insult to injury, some states promptly passed their own tariffs on imported goods. The failure of the tariff strategy prompted one critic of the Confederation government to comment, 13 wheels require a steady and powerful regulation to keep them in good order. Until Congress could act without the unanimous consent of all states, nothing could prevent the machine from becoming useless. Basically, the Articles of Confederation are not flexible enough to allow our nation to move forward. It matters today, having a vision for the future, a special feature on page 156. In 1791, Alexander Hamilton outlined his vision for the economic future of the United States. When Hamilton predicted that manufacturing would and should overtake agriculture as the basis for the American economy, he knew he would be setting himself against some of the most important people in the nation. Hamilton's report on manufactures was not adopted by Congress, but the ideas that it set forth would eventually become central to the economy of the United States. Hamilton's belief that a strong central government with broad economic powers could encourage the fledgling manufacturing industries of the new country set the stage for this country to become the economic superpower that it is today. Newly elected presidents often outline their vision for the nation's future in their inaugural addresses. If you want to, you can select one such inaugural address and analyze the vision that it offers. If you had the chance to put forward your vision of the future, what priorities would you insist upon? The Northwest Ordinances. The Confederation turned to the sale of Western lands to solve its financial problems. Here, at least, Congress had the authority to act, for it could set policy for the settlement and governance of all national territories. In 1784, 1785, and 1787, a national land policy took shape in 3 Northwest Ordinances. These are very important. AP loves to ask about the Northwest Ordinances. In 1784, the ordinance established that 5 new states would be carved out of the region, each to stand on an equal footing with the older original states. In the earliest stages of settlement, each territory would have an appointed governor. As soon as the number of eligible voters in the territory increased sufficiently, however, they could elect a representative assembly and the territory could begin to govern itself. Once a state constitution was drafted and approved by the territory's voters, the new state could send elected representatives to the Confederation Congress. Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin would each follow this path to full statehood. The Ordinance of 1785 spelled out the terms for sale of the land. Mapmakers divided the region into 5 districts and subdivided each district into townships. Each township, covering 36 square miles, was broken down in a grid-like pattern of 36 640-acre plots. Congress intended to auction off these plots to individual settlers rather than to land speculators, but when the original selling price of $1 per acre in hard currency was too high for the average farm family, Congress lowered the price and lifted the ban on sales to land speculators. The Ordinance of 1787 established that 60,000 adult white males were needed for a territory to apply for admission as a state. Thomas Jefferson, who drafted this ordinance, took care to protect the liberties of the settlers with a Bill of Rights and to ban slavery north of the Ohio River. Yet these provisions trampled on the rights of American Indians whose claims to the land were ignored. Overall, then, the Northwest Ordinances provide for orderly settlement and a path to statehood, and this is the first time that we see a geographical basis for a ban on slavery. Diplomatic problems. The Confederation's diplomatic record was as discouraging as its financial plight. Problems with the British and the Indians arose as settlers began to pour into the Northwest Territory. According to the Treaty of Paris, the British were to evacuate their western forts, but they refused to do so until the Americans honored their treaty promises to repay war debts and to return confiscated property to loyalists. Instead, the British encouraged Indian resistance by selling arms and supplies to the Shawnees, Miamis, and Delawares, who denied the legitimacy of the 2 treaties that turned over the Northwest Territories to the Americans. Trouble is brewing out west. American claims to Western lands rested on the 1784 Treaty of Fort Stanwix and the 1785 Hopewell treaties. But these treaties had not been approved by all of the tribes of either area. The Shawnees and their allies challenged both treaties, arguing that other tribes had no right to speak for them. Throughout the 1780s, the Confederation and the Indians resorted to warfare rather than negotiation. The Confederation preferred diplomacy to armed conflict when dealing with European powers. The new nation desperately needed trade concessions from Britain, for commercial ties with France and Holland had not developed as rapidly as some patriots had predicted. American merchants thus remained economically dependent on England as a source of manufactured goods, and on British possessions in the Caribbean for trade. Congress sent John Adams to Great Britain, but the American bargaining position was weak. Britain had no desire to help America end its economic woes. The Confederation had problems with allies as well as with enemies. Spain, for example, was alarmed to find thousands of Americans ready to join the almost 50,000 Americans who had already moved into what would become Kentucky and Tennessee. The Spanish government, which controlled access to the Mississippi River and the port of New Orleans, responded to this threat by banning all American traffic on the river. The Confederation appointed John Jay, fresh from his success as a Paris Peace Commissioner, to negotiate with Spain on this and other issues, but Jay could make no headway. The Confederation had no better luck in dealing with the Barbary pirates. For many years, the rulers of Algiers, Tunisia, Tripoli, and Morocco had taken advantage of their location along the Barbary coast of North Africa to attack European vessels engaged in Mediterranean trade. Most European nations kept this piracy under control by paying blackmail or by providing armed naval escorts for their merchant ships. The Barbary pirates found a new target in the American merchant marine, for American ships no longer sailed under the protection of the British Royal Navy. In 1785, a New England ship was captured, its cargo seized, and the crew was stripped and sold into slavery. The Confederation Congress was outraged, but with no navy and no authority to create one, it could do nothing to ensure American safety in the Mediterranean. In the Wider World, Rebellion, a special feature on page 158. The last decades of the 18th century witnessed a number of revolutions, rebellions, and independence movements. In 1789, the year after the US Constitution was ratified, French radicals stormed the Paris prison, the Bastille, setting in motion that country's revolution. In that same year, in the Portuguese colony of Brazil, colonists like Joaquim José de Silva Xavier were inspired by the American Revolution to give their lives in an attempt to win their independence. 2 years later, men like Dutty Boukman led slaves on the French sugar island of Haiti in launching a revolt that became a decade of civil war and ended in the first independent nation in Latin America. And in 1798 in Ireland, a coalition of Protestants and Catholics led by men such as Henry Joy McCracken and Henry Monroe would mount an unsuccessful revolt to win their independence from England. A farmers' revolt. The post-war economic depression weighed heavily on backcountry farmers, and these Americans began to protest burdens they had long resented: high rents and land prices, heavy taxes, debts, oppressive legal fees, and the failure of their governments to provide protection from Indian attacks and frontier bandits. They used the language of republicanism to defend their position and to justify the occasional violence that erupted in their areas. "We fought for land and liberty," wrote one squatter in response to a land speculator's claim to his farm. A squatter, by the way, is a person who settles on unoccupied land to which they have no legal claim. The squatter continued, "Who can have a better right to the land than we who have fought for it, subdued it, and made it valuable?" Members of the political and economic elite who remembered the violence of the Regulator movement and the Paxton Boys' revolt grew uneasy. When farmers in Western Massachusetts began an organized protest in 1786, this uneasiness reached crisis proportions. Western Massachusetts farmers were among those hardest hit by the post-war depression. Many were deeply in debt to creditors who held mortgages on their farms. In the 1780s, these farmers looked to the state governments for temporary relief, hoping that it would pass stay laws that would temporarily suspend creditors' rights to foreclose on lands and farm equipment. The Massachusetts Assembly responded sympathetically, but met stubborn resistance from the merchants and creditors, who were themselves deeply in debt to foreign manufacturers. The upper house of the state legislature, with its more elite members, sided with the creditors and blocked the passage of stay laws. The Massachusetts government then shocked the farmers by raising taxes. In 1786, hundreds of farmers revolted. They believed they were protecting their rights and their communities as true Republicans must do. To their creditors, though, the farmers appeared to be dangerous lawbreakers threatening the state with anarchy, confusion, and total ruin. The farmers, led by men such as Revolutionary War veteran Daniel Shays, closed several courts and freed a number of their fellow farmers from debtor's prison. Shays' rebellion is a major thing, listen carefully here. Their actions struck a chord among desperate farmers in other New England states, and fear of a widespread uprising spurred the Massachusetts government to action. It sent a military force of 600 to Springfield, where more than 1,000 farmers, most armed with pitchforks rather than guns, had gathered to close the local courthouse. The troops let loose a cannon barrage that killed 4 protesters and set the remaining men to flight. Although Daniel Shays managed to escape, by February 4th, 1787, the farmers' revolt was over. Shays' rebellion brought to a head long-standing antagonisms or differences between farmers and the coastal merchant elite. And the farmers who joined Shays were acting as they had been encouraged to act in the pre-revolutionary years. When the government did not respond to their needs, they organized and they protested. And when government still did not respond, they took up arms against what they considered to be injustice. They think they're being patriots here, folks. Across the country, many Americans sympathized with these farmers, but just as many did not. Abigail Adams, adopting language earlier used against her husband by his loyalist opponents, condemned the leaders of the farmers' revolt as ignorant, restless desperadoes without conscience or principles. The revolt stirred fears of slave rebellions and pitched battles between debtors and creditors, haves and have-nots. Above all, it raised doubts among influential political figures about the ability of either state governments or the Confederation to preserve the basic rule of law. To George Washington, Shays' rebellion was also a tragedy for the reputation of the United States. When the farmers' protest began, Washington wrote to authorities in Massachusetts, urging them to act fairly, but to end the unrest decisively, for to be more exposed to the eyes of the world and more contemptible than we already are is hardly possible. Basically, Shays' rebellion is embarrassing us on the world stage. We can't take care of our own house here. A call for change. By 1786, many political leaders believed the survival of the nation was in question. They regretted having created a national government so restricted that it could not deal with the problems it faced both at home and abroad. Washington predicted the worst consequences from a half-starved, limping government always moving upon crutches and tottering at every step. For him, for Alexander Hamilton, and for others like them who thought of themselves as nationalists, the solution was clear. A nationalist, by the way, means Americans who preferred a strong central government rather than the limited government prescribed in the Articles of Confederation. They're like Federalists. He said, "I do not conceive we can long exist as a nation," Washington remarked, "without having lodged somewhere a power which will pervade the whole Union in the way the state governments held power in their states." Here was a different form of Republican government to consider. Support for a stronger national government grew in the key states of Virginia, Massachusetts, and New York. Leaders in these states wanted to give the central government taxing powers, devise an easier amendment process, and provide some legal means to enforce national government policies that a state might oppose. They wanted a government that could establish stable diplomatic and trade relations. They also wanted a national government able to preserve their property and their peace of mind. At Alexander Hamilton's urging, in 1786, a group of influential Virginians called for a meeting on problems of interstate trade. With the approval of the Confederation Congress, delegates met at Annapolis, Maryland. But beyond trade issues, the meeting organizers had a second agenda to test the waters on revising the nation's constitution. Although only a third of the states participated at the Annapolis Conference, nationalists were convinced that their position had substantial support. They asked Congress to call a delegates' convention in Philadelphia so that political leaders could continue to discuss interstate commerce problems and other aspects of government reform. Some members of Congress were reluctant, but news of Shays's rebellion tipped the balance in favor of the convention. So Shays's rebellion leads to calls for a stronger national government. That's important to note. Creating a new constitution. Considering the questions, what major compromises did the framers make in writing the new constitution? And what safeguards did James Madison see in his checks and balances system? Late in May 1787, George Washington called the delegates' convention to order in Philadelphia. Before him sat men from 11 of the 13 states. New Hampshire's delegates did not arrive until late July, closeted behind curtained windows and locked doors despite the heat and humidity of a Philadelphia summer. These secrecy precautions stemmed in large part from the delegates' ultimate purpose. Rhode Island, refusing to participate in the deliberations, accused the nationalists of plans to drastically revise the national government. This accusation was correct. The convention did expect to make significant changes in the structure of the government. This objective and the need to freely make the many compromises it would require were ample reasons to keep the deliberations secret. Most of the 55 men gathered in that room were lawyers, merchants, or planters, and many of them had served as officers in the Continental Army. When Thomas Jefferson later referred to the convention members as demigods, he was probably thinking of the likes of 81-year-old Benjamin Franklin, whose sparkling wit and crafty political style set him apart from his colleagues despite his advanced age. Or of the articulate, brilliant Alexander Hamilton of New York, whose reputation as a financial mastermind equaled that of Confederation advisor Robert Morris. Or of James Madison, the prim Virginia planter who turned out to be the chief architect of the new Constitution. Or of Pennsylvania's Governor Morris. Even delegates of lesser intellect enjoyed the advantages of education and long political experience. Several notable men were absent. Thomas Jefferson was abroad serving as ambassador to France. John Adams was representing the United States in the same capacity in London. The charismatic Patrick Henry and the two great propagandists of the Revolution, Samuel Adams and Thomas Paine, were absent by choice. When asked about the intentions of the convention, Patrick Henry replied, quote, "I smell a rat." Revise or replace. Most of the delegates were nationalists, but they did not necessarily agree on how best to proceed. Should they revise the articles or abandon them? Virginia planter and former Governor Edmund Randolph provided the convention with the answer. The Virginia proposal he presented effectively amended the Articles of Confederation out of existence. Although Randolph introduced this Virginia plan on the convention floor, James Madison was its guiding spirit. The 36-year-old Madison was small, frail, charmless, and a hypochondriac, but he was highly respected as a scholar of philosophy and history and as an astute political theorist, and his long service in the Virginia legislature and the Confederation Congress gave him a practical understanding of politics and government. At the convention, Madison first considered one question: what was the best form of government for a strong republic? He concluded, as John Adams had done early in the 1780s, that the fear of tyranny should not rule out a powerful national government. The abuse of power could be curtailed or cut short by building internal checks and balances into the Republican structure. Madison's Virginia plan called for a government with three distinct branches, legislative, executive, and judicial, to replace the Confederation's Congress, which was performing all three functions. By dividing power in this way, Madison believed the plan could prevent any individual or group of men from wielding too much authority, especially for self-interested reasons. Madison's plan also gave Congress the power to veto laws passed by the state legislatures and the right to intervene directly if a state acted to interrupt the harmony of the United States. The delegates endorsed Madison's notion of a strong government able to control the governed, but also obliged to control itself. But they were in sharp disagreement over many specific issues in the Virginia plan. The greatest controversy swirled around representation in the legislative branch, Congress, a controversy familiar to those who had helped draft the Articles of Confederation. Madison proposed a two-house or bicameral legislature. Membership in both houses would be based on proportional representation. So how many representatives you get is based on how many people live in your state. Large states supported the plan, for representation based on population was in their advantage. Small states objected heatedly, arguing that proportional representation would leave them helpless against a national government dominated by the big ones. Small state delegates threw their support behind a second proposal called the New Jersey Plan, which also called for three branches of government and gave Congress the power to tax and to control national commerce. This plan, however, preserved an equal voice and vote for every state within a unicameral or one-house legislature. Debate over the two plans, the New Jersey Plan and the Virginia Plan, dragged on through the steamy days of a June heat wave. Tempers flared, and threats to walk out of the convention came from both sides. Ultimately, a compromise hammered out by a special committee was presented by Roger Sherman of Connecticut. This great compromise, also known as Sherman's Compromise or the Connecticut Compromise, proposed a two-house legislature to satisfy both sides, with proportional representation in the lower house, which is our modern-day House of Representatives, and equal representation in the upper house, or our modern-day Senate. The Great Compromise resolved the first major controversy at the convention, but opened the door to the next one, how the representatives in each house would be elected. A compromise also settled this issue. State legislatures would select senators, and the eligible voters of each state would directly elect their members of the House. This formula allowed the delegates to acknowledge the sovereignty of the state governments, but also to accommodate the Republican commitment to popular elections in a representative government. State legislatures would be selecting senators until an amendment during the Progressive Era, so that stays around for a long time, just to note. For the strong nationalists, however, both of these compromises were a serious blow. They had hoped to keep the states out of the national government entirely. Nevertheless, nationalists such as Madison and Hamilton accepted the will of the convention. The delegates faced one last stumbling block over representation in the House: which Americans were to be counted to determine a state's population. This issue remained divisive as it had been when the Articles of Confederation were drafted, but this time the positions of the southern and northern states were reversed. Southern delegates now argued that slaves, who composed as much as 1/3 and sometimes more of each plantation state's residents, should be included in the population count. Northern delegates now protested that slaves should be considered property. They were motivated by self-interest rather than a desire for consistency, for if slaves were considered property, not people, their region would dominate the lower house. The compromise that settled this question defied reason but made brilliant political sense. The 3/5 compromise established that 3/5 of the slave population would be included in a state's critical headcount. A clause was then added guaranteeing that the slave trade could continue for a 20-year period. Some Southern leaders, especially in South Carolina, wanted this extension badly because they had lost many slaves during the Revolution, but not all slave owners concurred. Virginia's George Mason, a slave owner himself, spoke passionately of the harm slavery did to his region. It not only prevented white immigration to the South, Mason said, but it infected the moral character of the slave master. Every master of slaves, Mason argued, is born a petty tyrant. 20 years after the passage of the Constitution, our nation would in fact outlaw the international slave trade, but of course slavery would continue until the Civil War. Drafting an acceptable document. The 3/5 Compromise ended weeks of debate over representation. No other issue arose to provoke such controversy, and the delegates proceeded calmly to implement the principle of checks and balances. For example, the president or executive was named commander-in-chief of the armed forces and given primary responsibility for foreign affairs. To balance these executive powers, only Congress was given the right to declare war and to raise an army. Congress received the critical power of the purse, but this power to tax and spend was checked in part by the president's power to veto congressional legislation. As yet another balance, Congress could override a presidential veto by the vote of a 2/3 majority. Following the same logic of distributing power, the delegates gave the president authority to name federal court judges, but the Senate had to approve all such appointments. The concern for checks and balances arose in part from the delegates' belief that all men would succumb to the lure of power, even themselves. To prevent the rise of tyranny in any branch of the government, its power must be held in check. Occasionally, as in the system for electing the president, the convention chose awkward or cumbersome procedures. For example, many delegates opposed direct popular election of the president. A few agreed with George Mason, who said this would be as unnatural as it would be to refer a trial of colors to a blind man. Others simply doubted that the citizens of one state would be familiar enough with a candidate from a distant state to make a valid judgment. In an age of slow communication, few men besides George Washington had a truly national reputation. Popular voting might lead to dozens of candidates who were favorites in local politics. When it was proposed that state legislatures select the president, delegates objected that this solution put too much power in the legislators' hands. As a somewhat clumsy compromise, the delegates created the Electoral College, which was a group of special electors to be chosen by the states to vote for presidential candidates. Each state would be entitled to a number of electors equal to the number of its senators and representatives sitting in Congress, but nobody serving in Congress at the time of a presidential election would be eligible to be an elector. If two presidential candidates received the same number of Electoral College votes, or if no candidate received a majority of the Electoral College votes, then the House of Representatives would choose the new president. This complex procedure honored the discretion of the state governments in appointing the electors, but limited the power of individuals already holding office. The long summer of conflict and compromise ended with a new plan for a national government. Would the delegates be willing to put their names to the document they had created in secrecy and by overreaching their authority? Benjamin Franklin fervently hoped so. Though sick and bedridden, Franklin was carried by friends to the convention floor, where he pleaded for unanimous support for the new government. When a weary George Washington at last declared the meetings adjourned on September 17, 1787, only a handful of delegates left without signing what the convention hoped would be the new American Constitution. A deeper understanding of history, the maze of history, a special feature starting on page 162. Historians know that properly understanding the past requires them to appreciate the uncertainty men and women faced as they tried to resolve problems that were big or small. Reading history, as it was lived and created by past generations, is like finding a way through a maze. People who made history faced multiple paths, and historians investigate why they followed the ones they did. The road to the future is filled with a confusing number of choices, and the only roadmap to the right choice is what people have learned from the past and what seems possible in the present. Consider, for example, one of the thorniest problems facing the Philadelphia Convention: how to elect the president. The delegates debated and discussed this issue repeatedly, but no agreement could be reached. In the last days of the convention, the weary framers sent the question to an aptly named Committee on Postponed Matters. The result was the Electoral College. To understand why the solution was adopted, a historian would have to answer three key questions. First, how did these 18th century men define the problem? Second, what were the real and ideological constraints they faced in 1787? And third, what alternative solutions were posed and why were they rejected? The first of these questions can partially be answered by examining the records of the convention, especially those kept by James Madison. but it can also be answered by studying the framers' understanding of why republics had failed in the past and what lessons the revolution had taught them about power. You would find, for example, that they were deeply concerned about a president becoming a tyrant. They believed that power corrupted, as they had seen repeatedly with colonial governors, parliament, and the king himself. But they were also concerned about the potential corruption of a group of men who might be given the task of selecting the president. For instance, if the Senate chose the president, would they pick a man whom they could control and force to do their bidding? The framers knew that an oligarchy, or small group of ruling men, was another form of tyranny, and they were just as fearful that agents of foreign countries, far more powerful than their own fledgling nation, would manage to put a man they controlled in office. Remember, they did not know how well checks and balances would work. The second key question requires, among other things, a knowledge of transportation, communication, and educational limits in the 18th century. The framers lived in an era before railroads, airplanes, or cars, before universal public education, cheap books, or electronic communications. Information and people simply did not travel fast enough to make campaigning for office among the voters practical. Finally, although popular election and selection by the Senate or by state legislatures were proposed as alternative mechanisms, they were rejected because the problems they raised seemed greater than those that might arise from an electoral college. For instance, having the state legislatures choose the president would give the states additional power in the national government, which was something the nationalists did not want. And popular election of the president would, they reasoned, lead to dozens, if not hundreds of candidates put forward by local groups, because there were not very many candidates who were known, to a truly national audience. In the end, the delegates settled on a solution they knew was imperfect, the Electoral College. If we understand their trip through the maze of history, we realize that criticizing their choices from a modern perspective is a form of Monday morning quarterbacking. Resolving the conflict of vision. Considering the questions, what were the Anti-Federalists' arguments against the Constitution, and what were the Federalists' arguments in its favor? And what was the outcome of the ratification process? The framers of the Constitution called for special state ratifying conventions with delegates chosen by voters to discuss and then vote on the proposed change of government. The conventions would bypass the state legislatures, which stood to lose power under the new government and were thus likely to oppose it. The framers added to their advantage by declaring that the approval of only 9 states was necessary to establish the Constitution. Reluctantly, the Confederation Congress agreed to all these terms and procedures. By the end of September of 1787, Congress had passed the proposed Constitution onto the states, triggering the next round of debates over America's political future, because now the states would all have to ratify it for it to take effect. The Ratification Controversy. As Alexander Hamilton boasted, the new Constitution has in favor of its success the very great weight of influence of the persons who framed it. Hamilton was correct. Men of wealth, political experience, and frequently great persuasive powers put their skills to the task of achieving ratification. But many revolutionary heroes and political leaders opposed the Constitution with equal intensity, most notably Patrick Henry, Samuel Adams, George Mason, and George Clinton, the popular governor of New York. Boston's most effective revolutionary propagandist, Mercy Otis Warren, immediately took up her pen to attack the Constitution as an assault on Republican values. Thus, the leadership on both sides of the issue was drawn from the political elite of the revolutionary generation. The pro-Constitution forces won an early and important victory by clouding the language of the debate. They abandoned the label nationalists, which drew attention to their belief in a strong central government, and they chose to call themselves Federalists, a name originally associated with a system of strong state governments and limited national government. This shrewd tactic cheated opponents of the Constitution out of their rightful name. The pro-Constitution forces then dubbed their opponents Anti-Federalists, which implied that their adversaries were negative thinkers and pessimists who lacked a program of their own. Although the philosophical debate over the best form of government for a republic was an important one, voters considered other practical factors in choosing a Federalist or an Anti-Federalist position. Voters in states with a stable or recovering economy were likely to oppose the Constitution because the Confederation system gave their states greater independent powers. Those in small, geographically or economically disadvantaged states were likely to favor a strong central government that could protect them from their competitive neighbors. Thus, the small states of Delaware and Connecticut ratified the Constitution quickly, but in New York and Virginia, big states, ratification was hotly contested. To some degree, Federalist and Anti-Federalist camps matched the divisions between the relatively urban, market-oriented communities of the Atlantic coast and the frontier or rural backwoods communities of the inland areas. For example, the backcountry of North and South Carolina and the less economically developed areas of Virginia saw little benefit in a stronger central government, especially one that might tax them. But coastal centers of trade and overseas commerce such as Boston, New York City, and Charleston wanted an aggressive and effective national policy regarding foreign and interstate trade. In these urban centers, artisans, shopkeepers, and even laborers joined wealthy merchants and shippers to support the Constitution, as they had once joined them to make the Revolution. No generalization can explain every political choice, though. No economic or social group was unified under the Federalists or under the Anti-Federalist banner. On the whole, however, it can be said that the Federalists were better organized, had more resources at their disposal, and they campaigned more effectively than the Anti-Federalists. Public debates sharply defined the political differences between the Federalists and Anti-Federalists. Anti-Federalists rejected the claim that the nation was in a critical period, facing economic and political collapse. As one New Yorker put it, "I deny that we are in immediate danger of anarchy and commotions." Nevertheless, the Federalists were successful in portraying the moment as a crisis or turning point for the young republic, and in insisting that their plan for recovery was better than no plan at all. And remember that Shays' rebellion is going to be happening. The Anti-Federalists struck hard against the dangerous elitism they believed they saw in the Constitution. They portrayed the Federalists as a privileged, sophisticated minority, ready and able to tyrannize the people if their powerful national government were ratified. Be careful, one Massachusetts man warned, because these lawyers and men of learning and moneyed men, they talk so finely and gloss over matters so smoothly to make us poor illiterate people swallow down the pill, expect to get into Congress themselves. And New York Anti-Federalist Melancton Smith, that's a name for you, predicted that the proposed new government would lead inevitably to rule by a wealthy, unrepresentative minority. The Virginia revolutionary leader Richard Henry Lee was flabbergasted that his generation would even consider ratifying the Constitution. "'Tis really astonishing," he wrote to a New York opponent in the summer of 1788, "that the same people who have just emerged from a long and cruel war in defense of liberty should agree to fix an elective despotism upon themselves and posterity." The Anti-Federalists' most convincing evidence of elitism and its potential for tyranny was that the proposed Constitution lacked a Bill of Rights. It contained no written guarantees of the people's right to assemble or to worship as they saw fit, and it gave no assurances of a trial by jury in civil cases or the right to bear arms. The framers believed these rights were secure because most state constitutions contained strong guarantees of them. But Anti-Federalists put the question to both voters and delegates. What did this glaring omission tell Americans about the framers' respect for Republican ideals? The only conclusion, Anti-Federalists argued, was that the Constitution was a threat to Republican principles of representative government, a vehicle for elite rule, and a document unconcerned with the protection of the people's individual liberties. Federalists countered by insisting that the Constitution fulfilled and could preserve the Republican ideals of the Revolution far better than the Articles had done. Their cause was put forward most convincingly by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay, who entered the newspaper wars over ratification in the key state of New York. Together, these three writers produced a series of essays known today as the Federalist Papers. Although these 85 essays were all signed Publius, Hamilton wrote 51 of them, Madison wrote 29, and Jay wrote 5. Their common theme was the link between American prosperity, American liberties, and a strong central government. The Federalist victory. Practical politics rather than practical theory seemed to influence the outcome of many of the ratifying conventions. The small states of New Jersey and Georgia joined Delaware and Connecticut and quickly approved the Constitution. In Pennsylvania, Anti-Federalists in the rural western regions lost control of the convention to the Federalists, and thus that state also endorsed the Constitution. In the remaining states, including Massachusetts, Virginia, and New York, the two sides were more evenly matched. Anti-Federalists were in the majority in the Massachusetts Convention, where most of the delegates were small farmers from western counties, and more than 20 of them had participated in Shays's rebellion. The Federalist strategy was to make political deals with key delegates, winning over anti-Federalists such as Samuel Adams and John Hancock, for example, with promises to demand the addition of a Bill of Rights to the Constitution. At the final count, a 19-vote margin gave the Federalists a narrow victory in Massachusetts. In New Hampshire, too, a close vote gave a victory to the Federalists. Rhode Island, true to its history of opposition to strong central authority, rejected the Constitution decisively, but Maryland and South Carolina ratified it. In Virginia, James Madison and George Washington directed the Federalist effort against intense opposition. In the end, the presence of Washington proved irresistible because Virginians knew that this war hero and admired colleague was certain to be the first president of the United States if the Constitution went into effect. When the vote was taken on June 25th of 1788, Virginia became the 10th state to ratify the new government. New York's battle was equally intense. Acknowledging its absence as a major political error, Federalist leaders Jay and Hamilton made a public pledge to support inclusion of a Bill of Rights. By then, however, 10 states had already ratified the Constitution, so the new government was a fait accompli. Realizing this, on July 26 of 1788, a majority of New York delegates voted yes on ratification. President George Washington. The election of senators and Congress members was almost complete by February of 1789, when presidential electors met in each state to choose the nation's first president. Although George Washington did not seek the position, he knew the nation expected him to serve. Hailed as a hero of the Revolution, looking and acting the part of the dignified, virtuous patriot, Washington became president by a unanimous vote of the Electoral College. For regional balance, New Englander John Adams was chosen as vice president. In April of 1789, as Washington made his way from Virginia to his inauguration in New York City, the temporary national capital, Americans thronged to greet him with parades, sharply dressed military escorts, and choruses of church bells and cannon fire. Thousands of supporters gathered to see him take the oath of office. Yet amid the celebration, Washington and his close advisors knew the future was uncharted and uncertain. "We are in a wilderness," Madison observed, "without a single footstep to guide us." Washington agreed, and he proceeded with caution and deliberation. He labored carefully over each of his selections to the almost 1,000 federal offices waiting to be filled. He took particular care in choosing the men to head 4 executive departments created with approval from Congress. Naming his protege Alexander Hamilton to the Treasury Department was probably Washington's easiest decision. He asked the Massachusetts military strategist Henry Knox to lead the War Department, and fellow Virginian Edmund Randolph to serve as his Attorney General. Washington chose another Virginian, Thomas Jefferson, to be his Secretary of State. Over time, the president established a pattern of regular meetings with this cabinet of advisors to discuss policy matters. Together, they made major decisions and, as Washington expected, expressed serious disagreements that exposed him to differing viewpoints on policy. And that's a good thing. He wants all these different viewpoints going into his decision-making. He doesn't just want to hear, what he wants to hear. He wants to hear from a diversity of philosophical viewpoints. Competing visions reemerge. Considering the questions, how did Alexander Hamilton's expectations for the new nation differ from those of Thomas Jefferson? What were the consequences of this conflict in vision? And how did the French Revolution affect Washington's diplomatic policy? A remarkable but, as it turned out, short-lived spirit of unity marked the early days of Washington's administration. Federalists had won the overwhelming majority of seats in the new Congress, and this success enabled them to work quickly and efficiently on matters they felt had priority. But the unity was fragile. By 1792, as the government debated foreign policy and domestic affairs, 2 distinct groups voicing serious differences of opinion began to form. Alexander Hamilton's vision for America guided one group, and Thomas Jefferson's vision guided the other. Unity's achievements. In addition to creating the 4 executive departments that became the cabinet, the first Congress passed the Judiciary Act of 1789. This act established a Supreme Court, 13 district courts, and 3 circuit courts. It also empowered the Supreme Court to review the decisions of state courts and to nullify any state laws that violated either the Constitution or any treaty made by the federal government. President Washington chose John Jay to serve as the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. James Madison wanted the Nationalists to keep their promise, and so he prodded Congress to draft the Bill of Rights. Indeed, the promise of a Bill of Rights is a big reason why the Constitution was able to get enough support to get passed in the first place, and adding the Bill of Rights is going to be a really, really important thing. On December 15, 1791, 10 amendments guaranteeing numerous rights were added to the Constitution. Soon after, both Rhode Island and North Carolina finally ratified the Constitution and joined the Union. These 2 states waited until after the Bill of Rights to ratify the Constitution. 8 of these original constitutional amendments spelled out the government's commitments to protect individual civil liberties. They guaranteed that the new national government would not limit free speech, interfere with religious worship, deny U.S. citizens the right to keep or bear arms, force the quartering of troops in private homes, or allow homes to be searched without proper search warrants. The amendments prohibited the government from requiring persons accused of crimes to testify against themselves, nor could it deny citizens the right to a trial by jury. The government also could not deprive a citizen of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, or impose excessive bail, or administer cruel and unusual punishments. The Ninth Amendment made clear that the inclusion of these protections and rights did not mean that others were excluded. The 10th Amendment stated that any powers that were not given to the federal government or denied to the states belonged solely to the states or the people. Condensed into these 10 amendments was a rich history of struggle for individual rights in the face of abuse of power. It was a history that recalled the illegal search and seizure of cargoes in Boston Harbor, the British government's insistence on quartering troops in New York homes, and the religious persecution of men and women who dissented from established churches both in England and in the colonies. Basically, problems in our history shaped the Bill of Rights and created it. Hamilton and Jefferson's differences. Alexander Hamilton was consumed by a bold dream to transform agricultural America into a manufacturing society that rivaled Great Britain. His blueprint for achieving this goal called for protective tariffs to assist developing American industry rather than simply raise revenue. Remember that tariffs are taxes on imported goods, and they encourage domestic production by making foreign goods more expensive, so consumers are encouraged to buy cheaper domestic products. It also called for subsidies or government financial support for new enterprises and for incentives to support new industries. And it relied on strong economic and diplomatic ties with the mercantile interests of England. Hamilton's vision had great appeal in the Northeast, but few advocates in the southern states. Indeed, his ambitious development program seemed to confirm Patrick Henry's worst fear that the new government would produce a system which I have ever dreaded, subserviency of southern to northern interests. Virginia planters Thomas Jefferson and James Madison offered a different vision of the new nation, a prosperous agrarian society. Agrarian means engaged in agriculture. Instead of government tariffs designed to encourage American manufacturing, they advocated a national policy of free trade to keep consumer prices low. Free trade means trade between nations without any protective tariffs. They did not rule out commerce and industry in the United States, but they believed it should remain only as a handmaiden to agriculture. In the same fashion, Hamilton was content to see agriculture thrive as long as it did not stand in the way of commercial or industrial growth. Hamilton and men of similar visions spoke of themselves as true Federalists. Those who agreed with Jefferson and Madison identified themselves as Republicans. Anti-Federalist becomes Democratic Republican or Republican over time. The emergence of 2 political camps was certain to trouble even the men who played a role in creating them. The revolutionary generation believed that factions, or special interest parties, were responsible for the corruption of English politics. John Adams seemed to speak for all these political leaders when he declared, "A division of the republic into 2 great parties is to be dreaded as the greatest political evil." Yet, as President Washington was quick to see, sectionalism fueled the growth of just such a division. And here we sit today, 250-something plus years later, with, of course, 2 political parties. Hamilton's economic plan. As Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton was expected to seek solutions to the nation's fiscal problems, particularly the foreign and domestic debts hanging over America's head. His proposals were the source of much of the conflict that divided Congress in the early 1790s. In January of 1790, Hamilton submitted a report on public credit to Congress. In it, he argued that the public debt fell into three categories, each requiring attention. First, there was foreign debt, owed primarily to France. Second, there was state debt, incurred by the individual states to finance the war. And three, a national debt in the form of government securities, those notorious paper continentals that had been issued to help finance the war. To establish credit, and thus to be able to borrow money and attract investors in American enterprises, Hamilton declared that the nation had to make good on all it owed. We basically are trying to get a good credit score here. Hamilton proposed that the federal government assume responsibility for the repayment of all three categories of debt. He insisted that continentals be redeemed for the amount shown on the certificate, regardless of what their current value might be. And he proposed that current holders of continentals should receive that payment. These recommendations and the political agenda for economic growth they revealed raised furious debate within Congress. Before Hamilton's report on public credit, James Madison had been the voice of unity in Congress. Now Madison leapt to his feet to protest the Treasury Secretary's plan. The government's debt, both financial and moral, Madison argued, was not to the current creditors holding the continentals, but to the original holders, many of whom were ordinary citizens and continental soldiers who had sold those certificates to speculators at a tremendous loss during the post-war Depression. The soldiers who were paid in these continentals basically gave them up at a much lower rate because they needed money then. And so he's arguing that it's not fair that the people who purchase these for a very low price are able to redeem them for a much higher price. He thinks that it's not fair to the original soldiers. The state treasuries of New York, Pennsylvania, and Maryland were three of the largest speculators, having bought up great quantities of these bonds when they were disgracefully cheap. If Hamilton's plan were adopted, Madison protested, these speculators, rather than the nation's true patriots, would reap enormous unfair profits. Although enslaved men and women performed the work done on Madison's plantation, the Virginia planter believed that wealth acquired by this productive labor was moral, whereas wealth gained by the manipulation of money was corrupt. Hamilton simply sidestepped the moral issue by explaining the difficulty of identifying and locating the original holders of the continentals. Whatever the ethical merits of Madison's argument, Hamilton said, his solution was impractical. Congress supported Hamilton, but the vote reflected the growing rift or differences between geographical regions. Far from silenced, Madison next led the opposition to Hamilton's proposal that the federal government assume or take over the states' debts. Here, Hamilton's motives were quite transparent. As a fierce nationalist, he wished to concentrate both political and economic power in the federal government at the expense of the states. He knew that creditors, who included America's wealthiest citizens, would take a particular interest in the welfare and success of any government that owed them money. Hamilton also knew that a sizable debt provided a compelling reason for raising revenue. By assuming the state debts, the federal government could undercut state governments' need for new taxes and justify its own. Congress saw the obvious inequities of the plan. States such as Maryland and Virginia had paid all of their war debts starting in the 1780s. If the national government assumed state debts and raised taxes to repay them, responsible citizens of Maryland and Virginia would be taxed for the failure of Massachusetts or New York to honor their obligations. Although the Senate approved the assumption of state debts, members of the House strongly objected and deferred a decision. Hamilton, realizing he faced defeat, sought a behind-the-scenes compromise with Madison and his ally Jefferson, using the location of the national capital as a bargaining chip. In 1789, the new government had made New York its temporary home until Congress could settle on a permanent site. Hamilton was willing to put the capital right in Jefferson's backyard in exchange for the Virginians' support on assumption of state debts. Madison and Virginia agreed to the deal. Like many good Republicans, they believed that it was important to monitor the deliberations of a powerful government. They liked the idea of keeping an eye on the Capitol. In an age of slow land travel and communication, it was difficult to keep watch from a distance. New Englanders knew that watching from nearby meant the chance to influence the government. Nevertheless, by trading away the capital location, Hamilton ensured the success of his debt assumption plan. As the year 1791 began, Hamilton outlined another controversial proposal, a plan for chartering a national bank modeled on the Bank of England to serve as a fiscal agent for the federal government. The bank would not be an exclusively public institution, but instead would be funded by both the government and private sources in a partnership that fit nicely with Hamilton's plan to tie national prosperity to the interests of private wealth. Here he is again trying to get wealthy Americans really invested in the success and the future of the United States. It's a pretty smart idea. Once again, James Madison led the opposition. He argued that the government had neither the express right nor the implied power to create a national institution such as the bank. The majority of Congress did not agree, and the bill passed. But Madison's argument caused President Washington to hesitate over signing the bill. Turning to his advisors as usual, Washington asked both Secretary of State Jefferson and Treasury Secretary Hamilton to set down their views on the matter. Like Madison, Jefferson was at that time a strict constructionist in his interpretation of the Constitution. A strict constructionist, by the way, also called a strict interpretationist, is a person who believes the government has only the powers specifically named in the Constitution. So you can't do it unless the Constitution says that you can do it. On February 15th of 1791, Jefferson wrote of the dangers of interpreting the government's powers broadly. To take a single step beyond the boundaries specifically drawn around the powers of Congress, he warned, is to take possession of a boundless field of power. Hamilton was a broad constructionist. A broad constructionist, also called a loose constructionist or a loose interpretationist, is a person who believes the government can exercise implied powers in keeping with the spirit of the Constitution. So it's okay to take actions that allow you to do things the Congress says you can do. If it's not specifically written in the Constitution, that doesn't necessarily mean that you can't do it. So Hamilton's a broad constructionist. He saw no such danger in the Bank of the United States that he's proposed. He based his argument on Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, which granted Congress the right to, quote, make all laws which should be necessary and proper to exercise its legitimate powers. This is the necessary and proper clause, also called the elastic clause, very important to note. Because it seemed obvious that a bank has a natural relation to the power of collecting taxes, Hamilton believed there could be no reasonable constitutional argument against it. Hamilton's argument persuaded the president, and the Bank of the United States was successfully chartered in February of 1791, with stock offered for sale by July 4th of 1791. To complete his vision, in 1792, Hamilton issued his Report on Manufactures, a package of aggressive policies aimed at industrializing the nation. It included protective tariffs and government incentives and subsidies. But this time, his program was too extreme to win support in Congress. Still, the Bank of the United States, which provided much-needed working capital for new commercial and manufacturing enterprises, and the establishment of sound national credit with the assumption of debt, had attracted foreign capital to the new nation. These things had gone far toward moving the economy in the direction of Hamilton's vision. Just because not everything he proposes goes through doesn't mean that his vision is going to fail. Foreign affairs and deepening divisions. In 1789, just as George Washington became the first president of the United States, the French Revolution began. In the next years, it would stir new controversy within American politics. On July 14, 1789, as crowds took to the streets in the name of broad social reform, Parisian radicals stormed the Bastille prison, a symbol of royal oppression, tearing down its walls and liberating its political prisoners. The crowds filling the Paris streets owed some of their political rhetoric and ideals to the American Revolution, a debt to the Marquis de Lafayette, who had volunteered in the American Revolution, acknowledged when he sent his old friend President Washington the key to the Bastille. Like most Americans in these early days of the French Revolution, Washington was pleased to be identified with this new struggle for the rights of man. Briefly, enthusiasm for the French Revolution united Hamilton's Federalists and Jefferson's Anti-Federalists or Republicans. By 1793, however, American public opinion began to divide sharply on the French Revolution. Popular support for the revolution faded when the revolution's most radical party, the Jacobins, executed King Louis XVI and his wife. Many shocked Americans denounced the revolution completely when the Jacobins, in their reign of terror against any who opposed their policies, began marching moderate French reformers as well as members of the nobility to the guillotine to be beheaded. Soon, the Jacobin government vowed to bring liberty, equality, and brotherhood to the peoples of Europe by force if necessary. This campaign to spread the revolution led France into war with England, Spain, Austria, and Prussia. At the very least, France expected the Americans to honor the terms of the Treaty of 1778, which had bound the United States to protect French possessions in the West Indies from enemy attack. The enemy most likely to strike was England, which suddenly made a second war between England and the United States a possibility. American opinion on a second war with England was contradictory and complex. Some felt the United States should honor its treaty obligations, but others who continued to support the French Revolution, including Thomas Jefferson, did not want the United States to become embroiled in another European war. On the other hand, many who condemned the French Revolution were eager to use any excuse to attack the British, who still were occupying forts in the Northwest and restricting American trade in the Caribbean, despite the fact that we're independent now, we won the war. Political leaders such as Hamilton, who were working toward better relations with England, denounced the French assault on other nations and opposed any American involvement. The French, meanwhile, plotted to mobilize American support. In 1793, the new French Republic sent a diplomatic minister to the United States. When citizen Edmund Genet arrived in Charleston, South Carolina, he wasted no time on formal matters such as presenting his diplomatic credentials to either the president or the Secretary of State. Instead, he immediately launched a campaign to recruit Americans to the war effort. By all accounts, Genet was charming, affable, and in the words of one observer, so humorous that he could laugh us into the war. President Washington, however, was infuriated by Genet's total disregard for formal procedures. Genet's bold attempts to provoke incidents between the United States and Spain stunned Hamilton. Even Thomas Jefferson was uncomfortable when the Frenchmen used the port of Philadelphia to transform a captured British ship into a French privateer. They're going to drag us into war. On April 22nd, 1793, Washington decided to act. Publicly, the president issued a proclamation that declared American neutrality without actually using that word neutrality, but he made clear that the United States would give no military support to the French. Privately, Washington asked the French government to recall or to bring back citizen Genet. The Genet affair had domestic as well as diplomatic repercussions. For the first time, George Washington came under public attack. A Republican newspaper whose editor was employed by Jefferson in the State Department questioned the president's integrity in refusing to honor the Franco-American Treaty. Washington was furious with this assault on his character. Federalist newspapers struck back, insisting that Jefferson and his followers had actively encouraged the outrageous behavior of Genet. By the end of 1793, Jefferson had resigned from Washington's government, more convinced ever that Hamilton and his supporters posed a serious threat to the survival of the American Republic. More domestic disturbances. Hamilton's Federalists agreed that the Republic was in danger from Jefferson's Republicans. By Washington's second term, because he was reelected in 1792, both political groups, the Federalists and Republicans, were trying to rouse popular sentiment for their programs and policies. Just as in the pre-revolutionary years, these appeals to popular opinion broadened participation in the national debate, and organizations rose up to make demands on the government. The most troubling of these to President Washington were the Democratic Republican societies. Between 1793 and 1794, 35 Democratic Republican societies were created. Made up primarily of craftsmen and men of the lower orders, these pro-French political groups also had their share of professional men, merchants, and planters. No matter what the background of the membership, these societies shared a common agenda to serve as a platform for expressing the public's will. They insisted that political office holders were the agents of the people, not their leaders, and thus they should act as the people wished. In 1794, protests turned violent. That July, a crowd in Western Pennsylvania, angry about a new federal excise tax on the whiskey they produced, ransacked and burned the home of the federal excise inspector, and then threatened to march on Pittsburgh if the tax were not repealed. An excise, by the way, is a tax on goods or services produced and sold within the country. President Washington, haunted by the memory of Shays's rebellion and worried that the radical spirit of the French Revolution was spreading throughout America, determined to crush this whiskey rebellion firmly. AP, by the way, loves to compare Shays's rebellion to the Whiskey Rebellion. Remember that Shays's rebellion led to calls for a stronger national government? Here we have another rebellion and we have a strong national government, so what's the outcome going to be? Calling up 13,000 militiamen, the president marched into the countryside to do battle with a few hundred citizens armed with rifles and pitchforks. In the face of such an overwhelming military force, including the first and only time that a sitting president has led troops into battle, the whiskey rebels abruptly dispersed. Washington publicly laid the blame for the Western insurrection on the Democratic Republican societies, and Federalists in Congress rushed to propose a resolution condemning these groups. By 1796, the Democratic Republican organizations had vanished from the American political scene. The president's public condemnation and Congress censure undoubtedly damaged them. But improvements on the Western borders also diminished the farmers' interest in protest organizations. In October of 1785, Carolina planter Thomas Pinckney won the concession from Spain that Jay had earlier been unable to obtain: free navigation of the Mississippi River. Pinckney's Treaty of San Lorenzo not only gave Western farmers an outlet to ocean trade through the port of New Orleans, but also ensured that Indian attacks would not be launched from Spanish-held territories. Jay's Treaty and the West. During Washington's second administration, the diplomatic crisis continued to worsen. England resented America's claims to neutrality, believing that neutrality actually helped France. The British, therefore, ignored American claims that free ships made free goods, and they began to seize American vessels trading with the French Caribbean islands. These seizures prompted new calls for war with Great Britain. Anti-British emotion ran even higher when the governor of Canada actively encouraged Indian resistance to American settlement in the Northwest. Efforts to crush the Miamis of Ohio had recently ended in two embarrassing American defeats, and in February of 1794, as General Anthony Wayne headed west for a third attempt against the Miamis, the Canadian governor's fiery remarks were particularly disturbing. Anti-British sentiment showed itself in the House of Representatives, where Republicans considered restricting trade with England. Outside the government, war hysteria led mobs to attack English seamen and tar and feather Americans who were expressing pro-British views. What would Washington do? Early in 1794, the president sent Chief Justice John Jay to England as his special envoy. An envoy, by the way, is a government representative charged with a special diplomatic mission. Jay's mission was to produce a compromise that would prevent war. Jay, however, was pessimistic. Britain wanted to avoid war with the United States, but what would British diplomats concede to his weak nation? Jay's negotiations did resolve some old nagging issues. In the treaty that emerged, Britain agreed to evacuate the Western forts, although it did not promise to end support for Indian resistance to American Western settlement. Britain also granted some small trade favors to America and the West Indies. For its part, the United States agreed to see that all pre-war debts owed to British merchants were at last paid. Jay, a fierce opponent of slavery, did not press for any provision to pay slaveholders for slaves they lost during the Revolution. In the end, Jay knew he had given up more than he had gained. He had abandoned America's demand for freedom of the seas, and he acknowledged the British Navy's right to remove French property from any neutral ship. Although Federalists in Congress credited Jay's treaty with preserving the peace, Republicans condemned it as an embarrassment and a betrayal of France. Once again, the president came under attack, and Kentucky settlers threatened rebellion, warning Washington that if he signed Jay's treaty, Western America is gone forever, lost to the Union. The treaty finally squeaked through the Senate in the spring of 1795 with only 2 Southern senators supporting ratification. Despite the criticism heaped upon him, Jay knew that he had accomplished his mission, for American neutrality in the European war continued, so we're not going to get dragged into another war. That's good for us. Although Jay's treaty damaged the prestige and authority of Washington's administration, the president did far better in military and diplomatic affairs in the West. In August of 1794, Anthony Wayne's army defeated the Northwestern Indians at the Battle of Fallen Timbers. Wayne then lived up to his reputation as, quote, Mad Anthony by rampaging through enemy villages, destroying all he could. These terror tactics helped to produce the Treaty of Greenville in August of 1795. By the Treaty of Greenville, the Indians ceded or gave up most of the land that later became the state of Ohio. These victories, combined with the auspicious terms of Pinckney's Treaty of San Lorenzo, won praise for the troubled President Washington. Washington's farewell. As his second term drew to a close, George Washington made a precedent-setting decision. He would not seek a third term as president. Instead, in 1796, he would return to his beloved Virginia home, Mount Vernon, and resume the life of a gentleman planter. American presidents would follow the tradition of only serving 2 terms up until FDR during World War II. When Washington retired, he left behind a nation very different from the one whose independence he had helped win and whose survival he had helped to secure. The post-war economic depression was over, and the war raging in Europe had produced a steadily rising demand for American foodstuffs. More fundamentally, in the 15 years since the Revolution, the US economy had moved decisively in the direction that Alexander Hamilton had envisioned. The values and expectations of a market economy, with its stress on maximizing profit and the pursuit of individual economic interests, had captured the imagination and shaped the actions of many white Americans. Manufacturing is winning out over agrarian or agricultural interests here. Hamilton's policies as Secretary of the Treasury had both reflected and advanced a growing interest in the expansion of trade, the growth of markets, and the development of American manufacturing and industry. In its political life, the Republic had been reorganized and the relationships between the states and the central government had been redefined. The new Constitution granted greater diplomatic and commercial powers to the federal government, but protected individual citizens through the Bill of Rights. America's political leaders, though convinced that factions were dangerous to the survival of the Republic, had nevertheless created and begun to work within an evolving party system. In his farewell address to the public, Washington expressed his thoughts on many of these changes. Although Jefferson had viewed the president as a partisan Federalist, Washington spoke with feeling against parties in a republic, urging the nation to return to nonpartisan cooperation. He basically warns us against forming political parties, which we're doing even as he's in office. Washington also warned America and its new leaders not to entangle our peace and prosperity in the toils of European ambition. An honorable country must observe good faith and justice toward all nations, said the aging Virginian, but Americans must not let any allegiance develop that draws the nation into a foreign war. He basically warns us against signing military alliances with other countries. It's okay to align, it's okay to do business, for sure, but don't, form a military alliance, he says. The final ingredient in Washington's formula for America's success and its permanent felicity was the continuing virtue of its people. Individual voices, Governor Morris speaks as more than a nationalist. At the Constitutional Convention, Pennsylvania delegate Governor Morris called on his fellow political leaders to set aside local and provincial interests and, as Alexander Hamilton put it, think continentally. But Morris urged more than a concern for national interest. He believed that the principles embodied in the Constitution these men were writing would inspire people throughout the world. Morris's impassioned speech would be lost to us if Delegate James Madison had not been secretly taking notes on the convention's debates. Historians of the era are fortunate that Madison disobeyed the convention rules and thus preserved Morris's vision of America as an inspiration to everyone. He came here as a representative of America. He flattered himself he came here in some degree as a representative of the whole human race, for the whole human race will be affected by the proceedings of this convention. He wished gentlemen to extend their views beyond the present moment of time, beyond the narrow limits of place from which they derive their political origin. If he were to believe some things which he had heard, he should suppose that we were assembled to truck and bargain for our particular states. He cannot descend to think that any gentlemen are really actuated by these views. We must look forward to the effects of what we do. These alone ought to guide us. Much has been said of the sentiments of the people. They were unknown. They could not be known. All that we can infer is that if the plan we recommend be reasonable and right, all who have reasonable minds and sound intentions will embrace it, notwithstanding what had been said by some gentlemen. This country must be united. If persuasion does not unite it, the sword will. He begged that this consideration might have its due weight. The scenes of horror attending civil commotion cannot be described, and the conclusion of them will be worse than the term of their continuance. The stronger party will then make traitors of the weaker, and the gallows and halter will finish the work of the sword. State attachments and state importance have been the bane of this country. We cannot annihilate, but we may perhaps take out the teeth of the serpents. He wished our ideas to be enlarged to the true interests of man instead of being circumscribed within the narrow compass of a particular spot. And after all, how little can be the motive yielded by selfishness for such a policy? Who can say whether he himself, much less whether his children, will the next year be an inhabitant of this or that state? Source, James Madison's Notes on Debates in the Federal Convention. That was James Madison noting what Governor Morris said. Summary. After independence was declared, Americans faced the challenge of creating a new nation out of 13 distinct states. The new nation faced enormous debt and was still surrounded by real and potential enemies, and its ability to survive seemed doubtful to many. As colonies became states, they drafted their own constitutions. Some put in place democratic forms of government, while others built in more restrictive features such as high property qualifications for office holding. The first national government, created by the Articles of Confederation, reflected the states' desire to preserve their individual sovereignty or power over themselves. It also embodied the revolutionary generation's opposition to a strong centralized government. The Confederation government thus lacked basic powers. It could not raise taxes or regulate commerce. However, it negotiated the Peace Treaty of 1783 that ended the Revolutionary War, and it established, through 3 Northwest Ordinances, the process by which territories became states. But with limited powers, the Confederation could not resolve the nation's financial problems, deal effectively with foreign nations, or ensure social order within its borders. Its weaknesses were demonstrated by Shays's Rebellion, among other things. By the time Massachusetts farmers rose up in revolt in 1786, Shays's Rebellion, many of the nation's elite political figures were calling for a stronger national government. In the summer of 1787, these nationalists met in Philadelphia to consider a new constitution. The constitution they produced, after long months of debate, steered a middle ground between a central government that was too powerful and one that was too limited. It established executive, legislative, and judicial branches that could check and balance one another and thus, it was hoped, safeguard the nation from tyranny. The new government could both raise taxes and regulate commerce. After intense battles between pro-constitution forces known as Federalists and their Anti-Federalists opponents, the new constitution was ratified by the states in 1788. Soon after George Washington took office as the first president, serious differences in political opinion again emerged. Alexander Hamilton's vision of a vigorous commercial and industrial nation conflicted with Thomas Jefferson's desire for an agrarian republic. The two resulting factions disagreed over economic and foreign policy. The French Revolution intensified the divisions. While Hamilton argued against American support for the French in the war with England, Jefferson pressed the administration to support their fellow revolutionaries in France. Washington managed to steer a neutral course in the European conflict. By the end of Washington's second term, the United States had expanded its borders, negotiated with Spain for access to the Mississippi River, and, under Hamilton's guidance, established a national bank at the center of an economic system that promoted market-oriented growth. The departing Washington urged Americans to continue to cooperate and cautioned them not to allow competing visions of America's future to harm the new nation.